Hello again. It is Saturday morning, and for reasons I'm unaware of, but they must be valid ones, they always are, the lady, Shirley, that is meant to be here doing yard work is not here, so with the wife gone, I have only the dogs, the geese, the fish, and all the wee beasties to keep me company. I must be terribly lonely. Not really. I was going to do a short video today on life in the village, which is usually a pleasing topic to the people that pay attention to my blog or take a look at it. But that got me thinking, and the more I thought, the more I realized that when I talk of my life in the village, I'm talking about something that no longer exists, that can't exist, that is now forever, or at least through this life cycle, is gone, will not come back again. Now let me take a closer look at that, and to do that, I want to take a closer look at this. There. Now, hopefully, at 5.6 F and a 1/80th second for the shutter speed, and at minus 0.7, this is going to be a pretty image. But tomorrow, this image will be gone. Now another one's going to come and look much like it, so it's not necessarily a big deal. But when I talk about my time in the village, I talk about the people that I met, the elders and the chiefs. Let's go with first names I'll go with now to honor the gentleman. Tommy. Tommy was what was called the big chief of the village. He had the highest rank. He was the #1 chief. Now, the problem was he wasn't supposed to be. It was his elder brother who was supposed to be the head chief of the village, but his elder brother, for reasons that made sense to him, and I certainly won't argue with, decided that he did not wish to live in the village. He didn't want to be the big chief. He became, I believe, a teacher off reserve and led a good life. Wrote a few books, children's books about stories from the village. He didn't turn his back on the village, he just found a life that was more rewarding in another place. And I say more power to him. But he had been trained since his youth to know how to be a chief. This is not something, a position you just took over and became one. This was something that you were trained for from childhood. Now, Tommy was a good man. He was honest, and while I heard some wild stories about his youth, by the time I met him, he was a solid citizen, respectable, strong, working man who had raised a family with the help of his good wife and the village, and I really respected that man. But he was in a point of transition in the village that was the end of the time that I went to learn about. I left the village after being in it for about 5 years. Now we're back to life in the village, and I'm talking about leaving it. Hello, dog. Don't hit the camera. And after, 5 or 6 years, Myra and myself were in Vancouver, and we went to the museum at the University of British Columbia. And lo and behold, they had a whole section given over to the village that I was trained in. And looking at that just tugged at my heart. And I looked at Myra, I said, Myra, it's time to go back. And she said, okay. We went, borrowed my mother's car, went up to the village. It was 500 miles away. This was a bit of a trip. We took more than a day or two. And when we got to the village, we drove around and it was empty. Nobody on the streets, and this was strange. I knew something was going on, but I didn't know what. I had been out of touch for many years. So we parked the car in the new rec center area, or meeting hall. I said, Ma, you better stay in the car. I'm not quite sure what type of welcome I'm going to get. So she stayed in the car, and I started walking, and I went right into the new hall area, looked in the window, and they were having a small gathering. Not quite a feast, but close enough to it. And I saw all the people that I had fallen in love with, and one of them looked up and said, oh my God, it's Brian. And they rushed out and slapped me on the back and shook my hand and took me inside and asked me what I was doing. I said, well, my wife and I came up here to say hi to the village. And they said, where's your wife? And I said, well, she's in the car. And they said, you silly fool. I said, well, I didn't know quite the reaction I was going to get. And they said, laughed at me and said, go get her, go get her. And I went and got Myra and brought her in. They sat us down at the head table, of all places, and brought out the food, and they fed us, and they laughed with us, and they cried with us. And we were there for a couple of days, but we got there in the afternoon. And after we had arranged where I would stay and chatted and what have you, as soon as I can, Myra and I got up and we went to Tommy's house. And I knocked on his door, and he came to the door and he said, who is it? And I said, it's a ghost from your past. And he said, and he opened the door and he said, who are you? By that time, Tommy's memory wasn't what it used to be. And he couldn't remember me. But he invited me in. I said, well, I'm Brian. I was the minister in training here. And he said, oh, and we sat down, and his wife remembered me, and we chatted, and he looked and he said, why are you here? I said, well, Tommy, you're the big chief of the village, and I've been gone for 5 years. I needed to come and pay my respects and make sure it was all right with you that I was here. And he looked at me, and tears came in his eyes. And this was a strong, tall man who did not show his emotions all that often. And he said, Brian, nobody from this village has ever done that for me. And I was shocked. I mean, this is just sort of what you do when you go someplace new. You go to the chief and say, hey, I'm here. Especially if it's not even a new place, just a place you haven't been for a while, because you're a guest and you want to get all the things that go with that and do all the proper things. He had led the village, well or poorly, I'll leave others to decide. And while he was the head chief, it was a time of transition. The people who knew and who had lived the old ways were dying off. Old age gets to you that way. And the new people had become very much Western, very, I'll use the politically incorrect term, they'd become awful white. The generation that went to the residential schools, and you've seen that in the newspapers, the Pope has just gone and apologized for the Catholic Church's involvement in it, which was a good thing to do. But the people that I met that went to residential school, I asked them,